It's Thursday, it's 4:20. That means it's time to start the conversation. THC Live starts now. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of THC Live. My name is Shane Foxman. Now, you notice I'm flying solo today. Nikita Graham away on special assignment for the next couple of weeks. I believe she's doing some form of research. What exactly she's researching, we're not really sure, but we look forward to her report when she gets back. Before we get to who's on the show today and what we have for you, some bookkeeping to take care of. Of course, if you're watching us now on Facebook Live, you know we're on Facebook. And you can see, as Nikita says, somewhere on the bottom of the screen as you're watching, there's a spot if you have a question or a comment for us or one of our guests. Please feel free to send it to us and we'll get to it during the show. If you want to watch a past episode of THC Live, you can go to our YouTube channel. That's THC Live Space TV. THC Live Space TV, old episodes, different segments that we have dealing with the history of cannabis in our country and just other features that we've run over the last 9 weeks. So again, on YouTube, it is THC Live Space TV. Coming up on the show today, we're going to be joined via Skype from the University of Western Ontario, Dr. Steve Laviolette. One of his areas of study is marijuana and its effects on the brain. Obviously, as we get closer and closer to legalization, a lot of people with a lot of concerns, especially when it comes to what will the legal age be to purchase. We've heard all kinds of different numbers. We'll see if Dr. Laviolette has some insight for us on that. He'll be coming up in just a short time. Also, well-known attorney John Conroy will join us, an author as well. He's been involved in the cannabis or marijuana battle in one stage or another for the last probably 40 years, if not longer. He's going to join us live in studio. He has an interesting thought. He doesn't think marijuana should be classified as a drug, but as a natural health care product. So we'll talk to John. As I said, he'll join us on the couch. As mentioned, though, we do like to look back at history on THC Live and see how we got to this point in time. And if you've been watching over the last 8 or 9 weeks, you've noticed one kind of consistency. It seems every 10 years or so, either the government in our country or the government south of the border commissions a report to find out exactly what kind of effects marijuana has. And when the report comes back and it doesn't have the information that the government wants, all they do is bury it. Well, in this week's episode of Growing Pains, we see that once again. In 1990, just 10% of the U.S. population uses marijuana. By 2002, 11% uses, an increase of just 1% in 12 years. Now, during that same time period, 1990 to 2002, there's a 3% decline in arrests for all crime nationwide. But arrests for marijuana possession increase 113%. Arrests in New York City alone increase over 2,400%. 80% of those arrested are non-white. Police Commissioner William Bratton's CompStat program, which rewards police for pot busts, is widely credited with providing at least some of the incentive. Another possible reason? It was part of the goal originally envisioned by President Nixon.
I'm afraid you'll catch me picking my nose.
When he created the DEA, whether due to bad luck,
I got it wrong,
racism, greed, lust for power, or more likely a combination of all four, minority communities certainly seem to have been disproportionately impacted. But by the 1990s, there's increasing pushback from the medical community and people who need marijuana for reasons that have nothing to do with simply getting high. In 1997, Terry Parker becomes Canada's first legal medical cannabis user after he's given an exemption to grow and use his own medicine. In July 2002, Canada's Supreme Court orders Parliament to rewrite Canada's cannabis laws to allow for proper medical access. If they refuse, all Canadian prohibition laws will be struck down. The Liberal government hires Prairie Plant Systems to grow medical cannabis, but after spending almost $7 million to grow their first crop, the government orders it destroyed. They tell the grower to start over with just 2 strains to make standardization easier.
Ooh, ha-ha!
Also in 2002, a 5-volume report instigated by conservative Senator Pierre-Claude Nolan concludes,
Unfortunately, almost a century ago, the enactment of prohibition laws was made possible through public misinformation.
We have examined science and studies in depth. First, we really need to get our act together. In many ways, prohibition is a cop-out.
The Nolan report declares that scientific evidence overwhelmingly indicates cannabis is substantially less harmful than alcohol and should not be treated as a criminal issue.
Well, duh.
It recommends cannabis be fully legalized for everyone over the age of 16 and that all criminal records for possession be erased. The Liberal government ignores the report.
I am not listening to you.
By August 2003, the new buds from Prairie Plant Systems are finally ready. But the government now says they contain too much THC and orders the potency lowered by shredding the buds and mixing in the stock. The low-potency shredded mix is freeze-dried, irradiated, and sold by mail order for $5 a gram. On the brighter side, in 2004, judges in the U.S. finally overruled the DEA and forced them to allow hemp-based foods from Canada into the country. We'll let you digest that for now, and we'll wrap up Growing Pains in our final episode next week. Hopefully you can stomach it. That's amazing. A government report, the Nolan report, comes out and says everything that we know so far has been based on misinformation. There's scientific evidence that proves that it's less harmful than alcohol, and yet the government buries the report. How many times have we seen that over and over again in Growing Pains? It's remarkable. And we're not talking about, oh, that was back in the 40s. That was Jean Chrétien, Prime Minister. That's our time. And we didn't pay attention to it. And you see when the government was growing the marijuana and how many times they had to decide to just destroy the crop or grind it down with the stalks. Those are the same people that want to be the growers now and supply the marijuana to the dispensaries. I have a hunch there's going to be a lot of opposition to that idea. We mentioned off the top of the show our first guest, Dr. Steve Laviolette, University of Western, studies the effects, amongst other things, of marijuana on the brain. And that got us thinking, marijuana and its effects on the brain, and it kind of brought back this old PSA.
Is there anyone out there who still isn't clear about what doing drugs does? Okay, last time. This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Dr. Steve Laviolette joining us via Skype from London, Ontario. Doctor, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
I got to say, that's probably one of the most popular anti-drug messages of all time, but maybe not for the right reasons. I don't know if that actually had an effect on anybody.
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of the public service announcements were questioned as to whether or not they were very effective.
Well, that one for sure. As I recall, anyone who I knew back then who would dabble in marijuana, all that did was make them hungry. That had no effect whatsoever on, you know what. So let me ask you, is that a fair assessment? Is smoking marijuana like frying an egg on a frying pan?
Well, I don't think the frying the egg analogy is necessarily appropriate for any sort of drug of abuse, really. These sorts of public service announcements try to take the simplest message and run with it. But what we do find are some interesting molecular changes that happen when you're exposed to certain phytocannabinoids that are found in marijuana.
Well, let me ask you first off, just for those that don't know, and maybe someone who hasn't tried marijuana before, when someone's say high, what exactly is the drug doing to the brain?
Well, there are definitely differences between individuals and how their brains react to different strains of marijuana. So largely it's going to depend on how much of the psychoactive compound you're actually exposed to at a given time. And that's, of course, THC. And THC binds to these central cannabinoid receptors called CB1 receptors in your brain. And it modulates a emotional processing areas of the brain. For example, the dopamine system is activated by exposure to THC. So dopamine, of course, is a system that's linked to the rewarding and the reinforcing effects of a lot of different drugs with use, nicotine, cocaine, alcohol. So they all sort of have that common pathway acting on this dopamine system.
Okay, so we know it has an effect. Are you studying the long-term effects? And I imagine to study something like that, you do have to put in a number of years before you can see what the effect would be.
Yeah, well, we actually use preclinical models of brain development. So we basically take an adolescent model of human brain development. In this case, it's a rat. And the rat brain goes through a very similar sort of adolescent maturation process as the human brain does. So we can actually model a lot of the same neurochemical changes, a lot of the same anatomical changes that happen during adolescence using this very simple sort of animal model of brain development.
I would also think there's got to be some correlation between the amount of use, how frequently it's used, as opposed to once in a blue moon or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the sort of the watershed study that came out from a group called Anderson in Sweden in 1987, they showed basically a correlation between the number of times you were exposed to marijuana, the number of joints you smoked during your adolescent years, and they linked that to an increased likelihood of schizophrenia. And there was basically this very strong positive correlation between the number of exposures you had and the increased likelihood of developing psychosis in young adulthood.
Now, does that play a role in what you might be, as I know we talked a little bit before the show, just about everyone is different, so someone might be a little predisposed to a condition, and this just exasperates the situation?
Yeah, so what we know from the clinical point of view is that if you have schizophrenia, or if you're more predisposed to have it, genetically, for example, if you have a close relative with schizophrenia, if you have certain genetic markers that are linked to an increased risk of schizophrenia, if you then expose yourself to marijuana, and particularly strains of marijuana that have high levels of THC, your risk of developing schizophrenia gets quite serious. But again, this is a subpopulation of individuals that have this predisposition and this sort of inherent risk for increasing their likelihood of getting this disorder.
Would that be the same in almost, whether it's alcoholism or a gambling addiction to some degree? Because so many people gamble, not everyone has a gambling issue. So many people drink, not everybody is an alcoholic. So it's that same kind of subsection of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the most challenging fields in clinical research, this sort of the neurogenetics of addiction. And if you sort of follow the literature, you'll see contradictory studies coming out almost every other week. The interesting thing about the increased risk of psychosis with adolescent cannabis use, in one of our studies, we found there was a change in a protein called AKT, which is linked to, if you have polymorphisms in this AKT gene, you're more likely to develop schizophrenia if you smoke high levels of high THC content marijuana during adolescence. And we found that the AKT protein was actually very strongly altered in the brain following adolescent THC exposure. So we are actually starting to see these nice mechanistic correlations between some of these genetic markers and the proteins that make you more at risk of developing some of these mental health problems.
How much has technology kind of changed the way you do your research? I just think about over the last 10 years, whether it's mapping the genome or whatever the case may be, but because so much of it is about your individual makeup, technology must be changing the way you do your job all the time.
It is. It's hard to keep up with it, and it gets more and more expensive, unfortunately. I mean, for example, from our perspective, some of the areas we're interested in looking at are sort of the proteomic profiles that are related to exposure to different chemicals in marijuana. So you can take a tissue sample now and run a proteomic screen and look at hundreds of different proteins as they're expressed. So the efficiency and the scope of the sorts of analyses that we can do just get better and better almost on a weekly basis. So it's an exciting time to be doing this research.
Have you found anything or learned anything that surprised you that maybe went against what you might have thought your preconceived idea coming in, even though you don't want to have any, because I don't want to let the information speak for itself. But anything surprise you?
Well, one of the surprising things was in the control group, which are the adults. And we exposed adult rats to the same levels of THC. And none of these molecular changes or sort of alterations related to schizophrenia were present. There was some minor memory deficits, but it was really black and white. Whether or not you were exposed to the THC during adulthood versus when you were exposed as an adolescent, the magnitude of the changes were just stunning. So that was something that really sort of knocked our socks off when we first saw that evidence.
Well, that's interesting, Doctor, because so much talk as we get closer to July and legalization, and we'll kind of find out what the rules are going to be. The age of consent is one that gets a lot of discussion going. Will it be the same across the board? Will the provinces be different? Do you have a thought on that?
It is tricky. I mean, from a neuroscience perspective, we know that there are very important changes going on in the brain all the way up until your early 20s. So, for example, those connections between areas like your prefrontal cortex, which is important for sort of regulating emotions and controlling memory and cognition, those areas are still maturing and forming those connections with those sort of more primitive emotional processing areas in your brain. And that can go all the way up into your early 20s. So, whether or not the age of 18 or 19 is too young, I think that's sort of a hot topic right now, and we don't really know the answer yet. All we can say at this point is that there are definitely still maturation processes going on into your early 20s, and it's also going to come down to the amount of THC that you're relatively exposed to, and that's another sort of important issue that's going to have to be addressed.
Well, I would think when you talk about the research, the amount of THC, and I guess what the definition of heavy use is, or what's what's okay. Like, you always hear, well, 1 drink a day is okay. It's good for your heart, or a glass of wine, or, you always hear something. So what will be that line, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned alcohol, and just, if you've been following your news feeds the past few days, there was a big study that came out linking alcohol to various different types of cancer. So, I mean, the story about alcohol seems to change on a monthly basis as well. I mean, on one hand, you remember a few years ago this idea you should go home and drink a glass of red wine every day because it's good for your heart, it reduces heart disease, that sort of thing. And then we have contradictory studies looking at increasing the risk of cancer, for example. So, this is something that seems to evolve, and, it's sort of the exciting thing about science. There is sort of no final answer set in stone. We're sort of open to changing our opinion as the data comes in.
It's amazing that, as we talked about in our history piece, there's been so many reports, commissioned by the government that does the scientific study, and it comes back and says, it doesn't lead to violent behavior. It's not a gateway drug. Do you find it surprising that it's taken, considering all the reports, and there is scientific evidence, someone like yourself who, again, looks at the data, that it's 2017 and yet we're finally getting closer to whether it's legalization or at least some sort of control of it and decriminalization?
It is amazing that it's taken this long. And anyone with any common sense knows that the cost to the healthcare system, the cost to the social system related to the use of marijuana, even the heavy use of marijuana, pales in comparison to the costs associated with tobacco and alcohol and opioids. So, the fact that marijuana has been really demonized for so many decades, it is something that certainly makes you scratch your head.
Doctor, we're going to see if we got a question from one of our viewers. Camille could be around. Oh, yes, there she is. Thank you, Camille. Okay, thank you. Okay, Doctor, this one from Steve in Regina. Oh, another Steve. Sorry. It's Regina in Edmonton. Never mind. Regina would like to know if it's healthy and legal to give her children CBD supplements. Now, CBD is the medical kind of side of marijuana that doesn't really have any THC in it, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So CBD is the other chemical that we study. And CBD is really quite remarkable because that's showing a lot of promise as a potential therapeutic. So we've been looking at it mostly in the context of mental health, so schizophrenia. There's actually been some exciting clinical trials showing that CBD can be more effective than traditional schizophrenia medications with fewer side effects. In terms of the viewer's questions about childhood exposure, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about that. There haven't been too many controlled studies looking at whether or not CBD, even purified CBD, what potential side effects there are. What we do know from most of the studies so far is that CBD really doesn't have any sort of deleterious side effects. But again, this is something that really needs to be addressed. And I know there are studies going on right now looking at cannabidiol, looking at CBD as a potential treatment for pediatric epilepsy, which is a very serious problem. And most of the drugs that are around now aren't particularly effective. So I certainly hope that we're going to get some promising data in from a lot of those studies that demonstrate not only the safety of CBD for children in terms of pediatric applications, but its efficacy as a way to treat these really devastating symptoms associated with epilepsy.
No, you know what, doctor? We had a young woman on our show a couple of weeks ago who suffers from a form of epilepsy, and using cannabis and CBDs, it changed her life completely. Like saying, it gave her life back would be an understatement, the way it cut down on seizures. But I hear about CBD's use, whether it's pain, whether it's inflammation. It really seems that if Pfizer came up with CBDs, it would be the miracle drug and it would be everywhere right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, it's ironic because, for years, when researchers such as myself were looking at the cannabinoid system, there was very little interest from the large pharmaceutical companies in what we were doing. And it was only when certain jurisdictions in the States were looking at legalization, Canada started moving towards legalization, that we now suddenly see these research programs being undertaken by some of these larger pharmaceutical companies to look at, more effective applications for some of these cannabinoid medications. But that's absolutely an important point.
Yeah, no, as soon as there was money involved, the pharmaceutical companies wanted to get involved. Tanner in Winnipeg, one more for you, doctor, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Tanner in Winnipeg asks, many of us smoked some pot in our teens and turned out fine. And this is what we kind of talked about. How do we know how much is too much for our teens, given higher THC levels nowadays, and the fact that many teens will keep on smoking despite whatever the legal age limit turns out to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's sort of what a lot of our research is trying to address. So we're actually looking at the biomarkers that are associated with increased risk. So once we've got sort of this profile of the different molecular pathways that are turned on and turned off, ultimately our goal, can we develop some sort of a diagnostic tool, a blood test, a genetic screen that we can give to someone and figure out whether or not this person is going to be at more or less risk if they do decide to expose themselves to marijuana, and in particular, high levels of THC. So this is the sort of technology that we really need to be moving towards, and that the sort of studies that the federal government should be funding, particularly as we move towards legalization, and we're seeing more promise on that front.
Dr. Laviolette, thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Extremely informative today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That's Dr. Steve Laviolette from the University of Western Ontario, studies, amongst other things, the effects of marijuana on the brain. Interesting when we talk about what the age limit's going to be, what will the age of consent be? And he talked about, the front of the brain is still developing into your early 20s. I don't think there's any chance the age is going to be 21. You kind of get the feeling 18, 19 will be in the range. I know so many people concerned about young kids. And I've said this before on the show, marijuana isn't a new product. It was available to kids in high school when I went to high school 35 years ago. It hasn't gotten any harder to get if you're a kid. I think it's kind of kind of head in the sand to think all of a sudden kids that are younger are all of a sudden going to go because it's legal, they're going to want to go get it. They wanted to go get it before that, and those that are going to smoke are going to smoke regardless of what the situation is. But the more information out there and the safer it can be, the better it can be. Before we get to our news segment on the show today, let's take a look at the book club, see what's happening. Now, because the debate over marijuana has been going on for so long, and the same arguments keep being made over and over again, the ones that are true and the ones that are based on misinformation, we always find it interesting when we come across old pieces of tape that kind of makes you think the conversation could be taking place right now. See if you remember this. Turn on, tune in, and drop out. Do you remember that? Remember that? Timothy Leary, of course, talking a lot about LSD in the day. But when you listen to this clip that we're going to play you from 50 years ago, tell me it doesn't sound like a lot of the guests that we've had on the show over the last 9 weeks, whether it be Watermelon, whether it be Dana Larson, whether it be Don Briere and Carol Gwilt, whether it be Jody Emery. Those are the conversations we're having right now in 2017. Here's Timothy Leary from 50 years ago.
Let the government put on the marijuana package the scientific evidence about marijuana. Let the government put on the booze bottle what booze does for you. If they want to be concerned with public health, but they cannot pass laws and maintain laws which govern what people are going to do, particularly something pleasant. Why are 10 million Americans smoking marijuana today? I mean, these are not criminals, they're not dope fiends. Matter of fact, they come from your best colleges, and they're your most effective people. The latest statistic is that 70% of the freshman class at Harvard smoke marijuana. Now, that's my old alma mater, and I don't want to boast, but that's the sign of the times. You just can't stop intelligent, thoughtful people from doing something that feels good and right to them.
That conversation and that comment could have been made last week on the couch, right here on the show, and it probably was. It's amazing how it hasn't changed. Jody Emery was on the show last week. She talked about her upcoming court case in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. It's now been pushed back to December 4th. December 4th. We'll, of course, keep an eye on it and bring you the latest. We talked a lot about the fact that British Columbia had set up a 1-800 number and a website for you to call or email in suggestions, concerns leading up to legalization. How did you want to see it? So all the provinces are kind of doing the same thing, and some provinces are closer to making decisions than others. We already know Ontario is going the Liquor Control Board route. Not a lot of fans of that, but some other provinces have also come out over the last week or so with some of their ideas, and I want to just give you a sense of what we've come across. Nova Scotia says they will have their final decision by the end of 2017. So by the end of December, Nova Scotia will outline its plans. There seems to be talk a lot there about a government and private sector, so there'll be government-run dispensaries plus private dispensaries as well. What I found interesting was Fredericton, and I want to make sure I get the information exactly right. See, this is what happens when I do things technologically on my phone. The New Brunswick government here says it will enter the legal cannabis retail market by having the New Brunswick Liquor Board set up a network of tightly controlled standalone stores. Starting in July, up to 20 stores will be established with strict policies. They will be located at least 300 meters away from schools. Again, that's a rule that doesn't even matter. They will only display products under glass, and customers will need to show identification to prove they are the legal age, whatever that legal age may be. As I said, Nova Scotia by the end of the year. BC still gathering information we haven't heard. There was also a poll released today, and this one dealt with folks in the Yukon. So they're getting set to legalize marijuana in the Yukon, and they put out a survey to residents to see what they thought. And 81% of respondents support the federal government's plan to legalize cannabis. More than 85% support the Yukon's priorities to focus on public health and harm reduction, preventing negative impacts on youth. About 75% of people agreed that it was either completely or somewhat acceptable to occasionally smoke or eat cannabis for recreational purposes. Here, one last one. 45% of respondents stated that the minimum age for possessing, purchasing, or growing cannabis should be 19. So again, we talk the different provinces, the different jurisdictions, everyone kind of trying to come to grips with it. I don't understand why, if you're a province of British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, wherever in Canada, you don't go, who's doing this already? Oh, Colorado's doing this already. I wonder how it worked. You go down there, you spend some time, you talk to the people who implement it, and they'll say to you, you know what, we thought this was going to be an issue, crime or whatever, and it didn't play out that way. We heard from the medical officer of health in Denver a couple of weeks ago on the show. We thought there'd be crime, it didn't play that way, but here's what we didn't realize. We didn't realize that there was going to be lineups down the street, and we don't like the optics of there being lineups around the block at dispensaries. Maybe we have to raise the limit of how much you can buy at one time. Whatever things they came across, whatever things that were good and were bad, the governments here could just look at and go, okay, great, pick it up and implement it. It really shouldn't be that difficult at this point in time. If you're not the first person, it's easy to learn from the mistakes and successes of other communities. It really doesn't seem that difficult. What's going on in Manitoba? Manitoba also has decided to come up with its plan. And Manitoba brought up some interesting points. They were talking about, they've signaled that it's going to be also some type of a hybrid system. There'll be private retailers and there'll be government-run retailers. They will not follow Ontario and now New Brunswick, who's also jumped on the bandwagon of having the Liquor Control Board deal with this situation. And I haven't met anyone who says, yeah, it's a great idea to either sell it at the liquor store or have the government run the entire show. And as we saw in our growing pains piece, when you saw the government decided, you know what, the THC level's too high in this, let's grind it all up, let's mix it in with the stocks, let's freeze it, Michael, what was that word? Iridate? Michael? Iridate? Michael's not listening. Mike, take your headset off. What was that word? Iridate? Irradiate, thank you. I had trouble with that word. Irradiate it, and then sold it for $5 a gram. You know what? No one's buying that. You'd still have a black market. You would still have everyone doing what they were doing before. That is a no-win plan. We'll talk more about the government's plans and what we can expect coming up. Our next guest, well-known lawyer, he's an author, was the lead counsel on the Allard case, which of course led to the constitutional challenge of marijuana for medical purposes. Regulations allowed someone to grow for themselves or have a caregiver do it for them. Joining us in studio, John Conroy. John, thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate it. Nice to meet you. Before we get to what's going on now, we had an attorney on weeks and weeks ago, and I'm always fascinated. He was from the south of the border, and we wondered how you got involved in the first place. And I imagine a case comes across your desk at some point, and the rest kind of just follow suit. What was it for you?
Well, I mean, I was aware of cannabis to some extent before I started practicing law, but not to a great extent. And it was once I started practicing criminal law and defending people that I was politicized by what judges were doing in terms of sending people to jail in those days for simple possession and things like that. And, you know, these were people who drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes and popped Valiums and things like that. And so the hypocrisy was a bit much. And of course, when you're practicing criminal law, you're dealing not only with whether the person has done it or not, but the penalties. And so doing that to somebody for something that I knew from my history growing up. My father was a consultant on the growing of tobacco in Africa. I knew Africans who smoked, or dacha they called it, right, cannabis. And if he saw a marijuana plant amongst the tobacco plants, he'd pull it up and throw it on the ground, and the sky didn't fall in. And so, you know, I had come into a situation where even alcohol wasn't as controlled in Africa as it was when I came here. I was surprised that young people couldn't go into a bar, say, with the parent. Not right, that they could drink, but at least be with the parent, things like that. So it was an eye-opener to me. But then things changed over the whole period of time that I've been practicing. And so we're in I mean, I didn't know anything about the medical and that sort of thing in those early days. It was all criminal law and punishment and trying to prevent that from happening.
And I would think that once you took one case, and showed an interest in it, like in the sense of, yeah, there is a hypocrisy to this. It wasn't just that you took the case and moved on to your next case, that other people that would find themselves in that legal you'd become the guy to go to.
Well, that really started once in about, well, I guess it would be mid to late 70s when I took on the role as the lawyer for the Abbotsford Community Law Office, which was a new concept in terms of delivering legal services with trying to focus on the issues that were important in the community. And people came to me about the marijuana issue. They wanted to do all sorts of things that would, smoke-ins and all that sort of stuff. And I said, well, I think what you need to do is incorporate a lobby group. So I got permission from Norml, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in the US, to use the name, and we created Norml Canada. And in those days, because people were going to jail and nobody thought it was legal, as they do now, people formed groups and lobbied and so on, and it was quite active. And also, shortly after, I think I was I was still in that role, I think, but almost transitioning out. Randy Kane came to me, charged with simple possession at the beach in White Rock, and ended up charged with possession, and he wanted to challenge the laws. And we ended up catching up to David Malmo Levine in the Court of Appeal with his a club that he had in the park in Vancouver back in those days. And Chris Clay had a shop in Toronto. And so we ended up catching up to David in the Court of Appeal, getting a dissent in the Court of Appeal, which gave us a right of appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And so all three cases were heard together in the Supreme Court of Canada, I think 2003. If I'm not mistaken, and the court basically said, look, this is a matter for Parliament, it's a political issue, because we were arguing that the John Stuart Mill principle of, if there's no harm or no significant harm, you shouldn't be using the criminal law and threatening people's liberty. But the court said that that principle was not a principle of fundamental justice and that we really had to do politics. And it was after that I started to become more familiar with the, well, no, that's actually, now that I think back of it, I incorporated the BC Compassion Club Society in '97, so I'd actually already started to be exposed to all the medical aspects, which I hadn't really been exposed to at all in the early days, even though there was stuff there, especially about China and other places that had used it in natural health care type product medicines for a long time. So it was after that sure, I did many cases and watched the industry change from
that's what I'm thinking,
all
for sure.
of the imports from Colombia and Thailand and everywhere and all these big cases that we had into becoming an export economy where BC Bud became the brand, and we were supplying, I understand from U.S. Department of Justice statistics, 5% of the U.S. market, 80% of our market, shipping it into the States, and that became big business for all sorts of people for a long time. And then they legalized in Washington State and Colorado, so that again changed the whole scene to developing into what we have now.
From when you started, was it possible to even see what's coming July 1st? Could you foresee that, or did law enforcement, the government, and everyone seem so with their heels dug in that no, smoking a joint is the same as snorting a line or shooting up? That's the way it would seem to be that it was being handled.
It was certainly that way in the beginning, but don't forget, this is not the first time we've come up to a promise of legalization. I think it's the fourth or fifth time. I mean, Pierre Trudeau suggested a certain type. I mean, legalization, and it was always talked about, was decriminalization, removing it from the criminal law. Legalization goes beyond that, or it's supposed to. People now call this legalization, and really there's a huge framework of criminal law that still surrounds even the proposed Cannabis Act. But basically there were, one was to move it to the Food and Drug Act, one was to create a new schedule. There were all kinds of different things that came up to. There were promises in the elections, and then when people got elected, they had bigger things to do, and often it fell by the wayside and never happened. This time, though, I don't expect
seems like the
change.
genie's out of the bottle. Like
you
couldn't get it back in now if you tried.
There's mandate letters that Mr. Trudeau gave to the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, Minister of Public Safety, saying this is part of their mandate in their portfolio. And the act is now there. It's gone through second reading, and we've had the Health Committee hearings. and it's back in the House, and so all of that's in time. I mean, you've got, to my great surprise, all these groups, not so much, even the police, going on about having to train people and needing more time. The one that really surprises me is the provinces. When you know that Colorado is making $100 million per month over the last 12 months, you'd think that the provinces would be chomping at the bit. I think New Brunswick is, but...
Well, no, but as I said, wouldn't you just, how hard can it be to go to Colorado, spend 3 weeks there, see what works and what doesn't, bang, and implement it? It should be easy.
But it's interesting because the folks from Colorado were there at the Health Committee, Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health, when I was there, and I got to listen to them and Washington State. And then you'd still have other groups coming in saying, well, this is what's going on in Colorado, which was totally inaccurate. So there's still all this misinformation that's
seems to follow this issue constantly.
To me, it should be an easy thing to take the existing industry and regulate it. But for some reason, they seem bound and determined to create a new industry and push all the existing people out instead of bringing them all in and regulating it. I mean, with alcohol, we forgave the Bronfmans and the Seagrams and so on that were shipping all of the booze into the U.S., didn't we? I mean, so let's bring them in. We need their strains, we need their seeds, we need all of this stuff in order to be able to meet the demand that's there.
Do you think it's a good idea for every province to be able to have kind of their own rules as opposed to maybe going, you know what, let's make it easy. Here's the rules. It doesn't matter what part of the country you're in, the rules are the same.
Yeah, but we're a federal system,
right,
constitutionally. And so manufacturing, international things, those are federal responsibilities. The feds control the manufacturing of tobacco. The feds control the manufacturing of booze. But who controls distribution? The provinces. Property and civil rights, matters of a local nature in the provinces. Those are the responsibilities of the province. So that's why that. But the Cannabis Act clearly says, if you don't, province, then we will. So that there will be a national set of rules if the provinces don't jump in. And the feds have imposed upon the provincial rules all of the Tobacco Act promotion and advertising stuff. If you go to the Tobacco Act, Federal Tobacco Act, and compare it to the Cannabis Act, you'll see they're identical provisions.
Right.
And so some people have said, well, there's nothing in the Ontario legislation that deals with that. Well, it's in the Cannabis Act. So, it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out in terms of how people promote their products or advertise and so on, which you think they would be able to do to a certain extent.
Right.
And so that's going to be an evolving thing.
I mentioned this off the top. You think it shouldn't be classified as an illegal drug, but as a natural health care product?
Well, if they didn't introduce the Cannabis Act and they took it out of Schedule 2 to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, it would immediately be covered by the natural health care product regulations under the Food and Drugs Act. Because if you went to those regulations, you see everything in Schedule 2 is exempted from that act.
Okay.
And it fits all the definitions in that act. And really, that's what it is. If you're using it for medical purposes, it's a natural health care product. But Parliament and the provinces can avoid that by, probably putting in the natural health care product regs, anything in the Cannabis Act is exempt, and create its own legislation like they have for tobacco, like they have for alcohol. So we have a Federal Tobacco Act, we have a Provincial Tobacco Act, and we have regulations and so on. And I think that they've clearly are following in the footsteps of tobacco and alcohol to try and do it. But as you say, there's also the U.S. model. Now, we have to remember the U.S. criminal law is not a federal responsibility, even though most people would think it is because of the way they control the drug thing with interstate commerce and other powers that they have constitutionally. Criminal law is state in each state.
Is that way the states have been allowed individually to
That's what it's a part of the basis for that distinction.
We always hear that, come July, whatever it looks like July 2018, might not be what it looks like July 1st, 2020. Like it's an ever-evolving situation because, again, we'll find out things that work, things that didn't work. That's why it drives me crazy that we're not, we can take care of it all now in advance. But
4 plants, no more than 100 centimeters tall.
Yeah.
I mean, give me a break.
Right.
But it's a step in the right direction. And that seems to be the history, is that at least if we can get to that stage, hopefully the powers that be will see that this is really far too restrictive. You can grow 15 kilograms of tobacco on your place for you and anybody over the age of 18, as long as you don't sell it. You can make as much beer, wine, and spirits that you want and share it with your neighbor as long as you're not selling it. So, we know tobacco kills. We know alcohol is a major drug problem. If you go to your pharmacy, you'll see a poster, 80,000 kids got high last year. How? On their parents' medicine in their medical cabinet. And, I've heard kids get Xanax and they crush it up and they snort it at parties that they've got from the medicine cabinets and stuff. And you say, well, and you're going on about cookies and colorful things in dispensaries. We have not, I don't think, had any young person go in, child go into a dispensary to try and get a colorful cookie. It's the parents who leave them lying around who are the problem.
Exactly.
And so, great, we've got child-proof packaging, but they have to remember to seal them.
Yeah, exactly. The lock on the door is amazing unless you don't lock it.
Yeah.
Doesn't really matter.
Let
me ask you this
reefer
before I take
madness still exists.
Before I take a question from the audience, from the viewers. What about folks that have now criminal records that deal with marijuana? Is there any talk at all about doing something for these folks?
Very little talk, and obviously something has to be done. Unfortunately, we've got to a stage in society where having a criminal record is maybe the worst thing to prejudice you. But even if you're charged and then they stay the proceedings, that's still going to prejudice you at the border. And the Crown will often not explain the basis for the stay. And it may simply be they didn't have enough evidence, and so stays, withdrawals, and even beyond that, anything in a government database. And so the police might stop you in a vehicle, somebody had a joint, you were in a vehicle with a joint 20 years ago, People who were applying to become licensed producers had to go through security clearances. And we would get things like, so-and-so you were seen in a car with a guy on your same soccer team, but we think he's organized crime and you're going to divert to the black market. Therefore, you're not security cleared, even though you spent maybe a couple of $1 million putting your facility together because of the process.
Right.
So having your name in a government database
is never a good thing.
Is going to be, in order to clear things away, to prevent people from being prejudiced, we're going to have to go way further than just criminal records. But, it should be relatively easy to eliminate a criminal record from the Canadian Police Information Computer Database. Will it be easy in fact and practice remains to be seen.
We're going to get another, Camille will bring on another question. You know what, I found out that thanks Camille, I found out that when you're crossing the border into the States, it's never happened to me, but the border guy can say to the U.S., you ever smoke marijuana? Really? Like, the answer is always going to be no matter what. It would be like when you get pulled over for the spot check ride. Like, why would you ever say to the guy, even if it was 25 years ago, because even if it's 20, why are you opening up that door? I'm surprised they can ask you that even.
Well, the guy in the uniform at the border has an incredible amount of discretion. And, sometimes you try to have people pre-approved and things like that, and you can't. And so it's a problem. Yeah. But I knew one fellow I thought was going to put up posters on big signs at the borders with pictures of Obama and Trudeau and saying they had smoked, and so why not us type of thing, in order to compare. When big important people who have to cross the border for more important reasons, they allow them to do it. But when it's somebody who smoked, as you say, 20 years ago, they can say no. I thought it had got better. I'd heard it was better. But
as he's asking you, you can see the sign behind him on the other side of the border that says, "Stop here for all your marijuana needs." Like, it is so ridiculous that you just scratch your head going, really? Here, Annette in Nelson asks, this is a great question. Will underage kids still be charged with possession after legalization, assuming they will still be buying off the black market because they can't walk into a dispensary?
Well, that's a very interesting question that hasn't been talked about much by anybody, and I think they deliberately don't want to talk about it because, yes, the Cannabis Act defines for certain purposes the age limits for certain purposes. And for possession, distribution, and sharing amongst each other, the age limit is 12 to 17. Okay. 12 to 17-year-olds will be able to possess up to 5 grams and share amongst themselves under the Cannabis Act.
12?
Everybody else is 18 and up. Now, obviously, it's a well-intentioned provision to prevent these people
from getting charged.
12 to 17 getting records
Right.
and all the rest of it.
Right.
And so it recognizes the reality that they're going to get it, they're going to share it amongst themselves. The problem is, where are they going to get it from?
Right.
You know, it's like getting your dad to go to the liquor store and get you a bottle of beer.
How many times does a kid stop me to say, hey, could you buy me a... But you know, that's the most thoughtful, though, the government has ever been. Just even seeing that, to me, is actually impressive.
Oh, it is impressive.
Because that's usually not the way you
I understand
think
why
it.
politicians won't talk about that
Right.
or bring it up. But I mean, it's there, and I think it's important. And, you know, they also have all these provisions where it's going to be a ticketable type of an offense for up to certain amounts and things like that. And we'll get into the detail. But so the officer is going to have a discretion in terms of the ticketing, or certainly if it's greater amounts to just revert to the regular process. But with youths, they will still be under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which is a very progressive, good statute that's led to the decarceration of huge numbers of young people compared to the old days, which was very positive. And others will be under the other sections of the Cannabis Act, but you know, which I'm very critical of, where they still have a maximum penalty of 14 years imprisonment for, you know, if you break significantly the Cannabis Act. So you say, well, you know, tobacco, what, it's 2 years. Booze, it's 2 years or 3 years maybe for breaching the Tobacco Act. Right. So why are we still, you know...
demonizing it.
And being excessive? It's a bit technical maybe for your viewers, but years ago, the government's introduced something called the Conditional Sentence Order, which meant that instead of sending people to prison, there was a whole effort to reduce incarceration, because we know incarceration doesn't make people better. It usually makes them worse. It certainly exposes them to all kinds of other things that they can do when they get out. So very few people really seem to benefit from prison. We have more better sanctions that we could come up with in order to address these problems. And one of them was to keep you in the community, and you keep your job if you have one, and you keep supporting your family if you can, and so on. But you're serving a sentence, you're under various conditions, you report all the rest of it. It's much stricter than probation. You breach and you're back in, and you can be sent to prison for the rest of the period. So it's like the last resort. Well, the Harper government took that away for all offenses that carried penalties of 14 years and up. And it used to be for production, the max was 7 years. Well, they jacked it up to 14.
So now it doesn't apply.
So, and trafficking is life maximum. You know, I mean, there's one for, if it's under 30 grams or 3 kilograms, it's 5 less a day. But again, you say, why are we sending people to prison for certainly cannabis offenses? Surely keeping them employed if they're employed and supporting their families and so on and so forth. If you want to sanction them with other conditions and so on, do it in the community, instead of forcing, people into prison. I had a case in Saskatchewan. We're seeking leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, and we managed to convince the judge that because of legalization, denunciation of the conduct, and general deterrence of others, that the decibel level of those sentencing principles had gone down. And that he didn't have to look at the old cases and send this guy who was trafficking in 25 pounds, we don't know the detail. And the going rate in Saskatchewan was 12 to 18 months. And so still under 2 years.
Yes.
But so the judge agreed and couldn't give him a conditional sentence order. So he said, well, I'm going to structure the probation order sort of like a conditional sentence order and put him on probation for up to 2 years. Well, the Crown appealed it, and the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal disagreed, and
well, that could open the door
months.
for some good stuff. Yeah.
So we're saying, look, surely a judge can take into account legalization, especially it was not just some politician making a promise. We've got actual
it's happening.
Mandates and so on. And surely Parliament breached the Constitution by taking away the conditional sentence order, because they're affecting liberty and they went too far. They went beyond what is necessary to achieve their objective, is basically one of the constitutional arguments. So hopefully the Supreme Court of Canada will give us leave, and we'll be able to deal with that before July.
No, I know. Let me ask you this last thing. Just quickly, Leonard in Okotoks, how will police and courts handle all the stoned drivers, or is this really going to be a big an issue as some are making it out to be?
It's an incredibly difficult issue because we know that people who consume cannabis, there's going to be something in your system for 90 days and sometimes more. So it's not about immediate consumption. And so there is how are you going to, there's no machine.
Now they have drug recognition officers, which seems to be a bit of a gray area anyway at someone's interpretation.
You know, when I first started practicing, the offense was impaired driving, to drive while your ability to do so was impaired by alcohol or a drug. And officers would get you out of the car and do the roadside tests and so on and so forth. Then they brought in the .08 breathalyzer thing, which was much more technical in terms of charging and so on, but that became more common and certainly easier for the police. But we don't have the same type of device for cannabis. Sure, we've got all kinds of looking at cannabis, determining its presence. And that's the problem with Washington State, 5 nanograms. And you're presumed to be impaired, and it's not rebuttable. Whereas in Colorado, at least it's rebuttable. Right. So the problem is for the medical users. Chronic medical users are all going to be over 5 nanograms, and they're not impaired. Right. Because they've developed such a tolerance that it simply removes their, in some cases, they're better drivers because they're not experiencing the pain
while they're
that
driving.
They would have.
Right.
You know, and it's the same in the workplace. People are kicking people out of work because, they've got a hot piss test for cannabis. And you say, well, you know, what was their condition when they were not on cannabis? Were they able to function and do their work? I mean, surely that, and are they engaged in something where there is a safety issue? You know, so it's very, very complicated. I'm very concerned it's going to lead to very unjust situations where people are going to be treated unfairly and are going to end up maybe in prison, certainly penalized, when they really haven't, their ability to drive is not impaired. We know that currently, and we've had people driving under the influence of cannabis for at least as long as I've been practicing, 45 years. And the evidence is 97% of the impaired drivers is alcohol. So we got 3% other drugs. And certainly other drugs are more than just cannabis. And unfortunately, the only way we have that would be fair, and it's certainly not the best, are these roadside tests where you're testing their motor coordination skills. Ideally, they should have a van at the roadblock with a simulated driving thing in the back where they can put the person in to test their actual ability to drive. Now, they're going to say that's too expensive. Now, I don't know, you know, if you have one of those in each town instead of hundreds of roadblocks at certain times, you might at least
set up a stand on the side of the road that was selling Doritos. Whoever pulls over at midnight, you know what? Probably gets a good bet. Otherwise, they're just trying to go home. John, thank you so much for coming in today. I really appreciated meeting you. Thank you so much. John Conroy, of course, author, well-known lawyer and attorney, been involved in the cannabis, the world of cannabis and its legal ramifications for decades. Our thanks also to Dr. Steve Laviolette joining us from the University of Western Ontario, talking about the tests and the work that he's doing as far as the effects of marijuana on the brain. Again, Nikita Graham on a research assignment for a couple of weeks, researching what, as we said, we don't really know, but we'll see. Coming up on the show next week, Dr. Dave Hepburn will join us, an award-winning syndicated columnist. Again, lots of experience in dealing with cannabis in a medical form and other ways. He'll join us. Plus, we'll also get spiritual with Mark Frogley. So all that and more coming up next Thursday, 4:20 Pacific time, right here on THC Live. Until then, have a great week.